Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump move closer to facing off in the race to become the next U.S. president. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. He's called the election process to secure the Republican nomination for president corrupt. But on Tuesday, businessman Donald Trump moved closer to becoming his party's candidate with sweeping victories in 5 states. On the Democratic side, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton added to her commanding lead by defeating Senator Bernie Sanders in 4 out of 5 contests. Later, we'll go in depth with our panel of political analysts about the nominating process and Trump versus Clinton. But we begin in our newsroom with CCTV's Nathan King. And Nathan, Hillary Clinton appears to be on a solid footing here to become the Democratic nominee. Much was made, though, of the Stop Trump movement. After Tuesday's results, has it failed?
Well, and about 3 people don't think either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton is going to be the nominee of their respective parties, and they are the ones that are running against those candidates: Bernie Sanders, Ted Cruz, and John Kasich. It was an astounding victory for both Republican and Democratic candidates. Hillary Clinton mathematically is basically there. Bernie Sanders, her opponent, is grudgingly talking about affecting the race in terms of ideas, but not about him now becoming the nominee. The big question is how and when will he drop out? On the Republican side, Donald Trump really routed his opponents across the northeast of the United States in margins that even he did not expect, taking some states by 60%. And what does this mean? It means mathematically now he can actually, looks like, get a plurality, a majority of the delegates needed, 1,237, before the Republican convention in July. And that is very important because that means he will win it without having to go to a second ballot. He still needs to win about 50% in every race, but it looks like he's going to.
Now, Donald Trump has been talking a lot, but of course he's short on detail. He did, however, give his first formal policy address on Wednesday. What did he talk about?
And the first policy address was about putting America first. That's his slogan. He basically says that the foreign policy of the United States is in ruins. And there's some basic principles here. Let me read them out to you. He says that the weaknesses in the U.S. is overextended. Its allies are not paying for their fair share. Friends can't depend on us, and rivals no longer respect us. It's basically a message of peace through strength, a plan to take on radical Islam, rebuild the military and economy, foreign policy based on core U.S. interests. He's basically saying no more nation building like we've seen in Iraq and elsewhere. And also he's saying by being strong, the U.S. can actually gain respect, especially with trading rivals like China.
Fixing our relations with China is another important step in really toward creating an even more prosperous period of time. China respects strength, and by letting them take advantage of us economically, which they are doing like never before, we have lost all of their respect. We have a massive trade deficit with China, a deficit that we have to find a way quickly, and I mean quickly, to balance. A strong and smart America is an America that will find a better friend in China.
Well, what China makes of a potential President Donald Trump remains to be seen. Remember, he looks like he's going to get the nomination, but of course running against Hillary Clinton is the all-important one for him, and that is going to be a race to remember.
Thanks, Nathan. That's CCTV's Nathan King reporting. Joining us now to talk about all of this is Atiba Madian. He heads his own government relations firm. Joanne Bamberger is an attorney and award-winning writer and journalist. Her latest book, Love Her Not, The Hillary Paradox, was #1 on Amazon. Joe Madison is a talk show host on Sirius XM satellite radio. And with us from our newsroom is Leonard Steinhorn, a former speechwriter and the founding editor of Pundit Wire. He teaches history and public communication at American University. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Leonard, let me start with you. Donald Trump, as we've just heard, sweeps 5 states. Hillary Clinton takes 4 out of 5, pulling away from her challenger, Bernie Sanders. For the sake of our audience, our foreign audience, who've been looking at a very complex process here, are we now looking at 2 nominees?
Well, if you listen to what each of them had to say after the vote last night, they are pivoting to the general election. They're training their sights on each other. Donald Trump laid out his attack lines on Hillary Clinton. He calls her crooked Hillary. He said she was responsible for a failed foreign policy, said she doesn't know how to create jobs. You can see the lines of attack that he's establishing for the fall campaign. And Hillary Clinton as well goes after Donald Trump on some of his weaknesses, character, women's issues, and his attacks on minorities. So this is going to be a hard-fought and really, tough campaign for both of them.
All right, Joe, Tuesday night was a big night for Donald Trump. If I had told you a year ago that Donald Trump was going to be the nominee for the Republican Party, you would have said what?
You were crazy. Probably most people would, and I say that affectionately.
No, I know.
But I don't even think Donald Trump would have thought that he would have been the nominee. But the reality is that he has pulled the scab off a lot of things that has been underneath in this country: xenophobia, racism, sexism, and he's appealing to the low-hanging fruit of the Republican Party. There is no ifs, ands, buts about it. Now, the question is, will that play in the general election? I don't think so, to be quite candid. I think when you get in, first of all, there will probably be more Democrats voting in the general election, and certainly more independents. So, but let me tell you, your guest is absolutely right. If you think the primary season is rough, you wait until after Labor Day. It's going to make this look like child's play.
Joanne, let's not go back a year. Let's go back 6 weeks. March 13th. This is what the Chicago Tribune reported. I'm paraphrasing, but in effect, this is what the newspaper said. Hillary Clinton will not be elected president because she is the lone candidate of the establishment in a year of insurgency. Rather brave of someone on the Tribune to say that so emphatically. But does that still hold?
I think it's pretty silly to say that so emphatically, given that to say that the first viable woman candidate to run for president is somehow an establishment candidate is sort of shocking to me. Yes, you have something that can be described perhaps as an insurgency with Bernie Sanders, but when you look at both of them and their voting records, they agree 93% of the time on the issues. On many things, it's really just a question of style. So I think now that we are at this point, not 6 weeks ago, but we're at this point where she is very close to clinching the nomination, you're going to see a really big effort to bring those Bernie Sanders voters in, and I think she's going to really start highlighting what I think Donald Trump tried to make a negative yesterday, and that's the woman card.
When you talk about the establishment here in the United States, aren't Bernie Sanders voters talking about the establishment, about those politicians that live inside the Beltway in Washington, rather than talking about a woman?
I think that's probably right, but then Bernie's part of the establishment as well. He's been an elected official for over 30 years. He's been in the Senate longer than Hillary was in the Senate. He was been in the Congress for a very long time. So, he's part of that as well.
Atiba, I think it would be fair to say that Donald Trump is not the candidate of the Republican Party leadership. But now that he looks like the inevitable nominee, how do they respond to that reality?
Well, just like anything, you've got to circle the wagon and get on board. If he's going to be the nominee, you'll see, if you want to call it the establishment, will come together, they will coalesce, they will support the nominee. Above all, the party wants to win. They want the White House, they want to be able to have full control of both the House and the Senate.
Leonard, there's been a great deal of controversy over this nomination process, the primary process, people who vote in the caucuses, and how candidates in this country are nominated for the highest office in the land. Let's listen to what Donald Trump had to say.
Nobody should be given delegates, which is a ticket to victory, and it's not a fair ticket. It's a crooked system. It's a system that's rigged, and we're going to go back to the old way. It's called you vote and you win.
So there's Donald Trump making his point there. And you add to that, there was a Reuters Ipsos poll which was released on Wednesday morning, which says half of Americans think that the process to nominate a candidate is rigged. Is this the best way to elect a candidate in the United States?
Well, look, it's a great talking point for Donald Trump because what he can do is basically say that all of these machinations, all of the attempts by Ted Cruz to win over state delegations and potentially deny Donald Trump the nomination either before during the first ballot or afterwards, it's a great talking point for Donald Trump because once again he can say that he's fighting the establishment, he's the one who's speaking on behalf of the average American, and that's really the brand and message of his entire campaign. But look, the rules were established a long, long time ago. In fact, Barack Obama played by those same rules 8 years ago and mastered those rules to the point that he really did put Hillary Clinton away because of such a good ground game. These are political parties. They're not our government. They're not national elections. They're elections within a political party to determine who the nominee would be. And every political party has a right to figure out what those rules are and for all of us to be able to vote within those rules.
You know, the thing that bothers me about this is that the average American probably didn't know how conventions worked in the first place. Let's just be quite candid. I've been to conventions after conventions. You want to talk about undemocratic, you go to a UAW convention or AFL-CIO convention. I served on the board of the NAACP for 14 years. They will turn off the microphone if they don't like what you're saying sometimes. Conventions are not a democratic process. And so the reality is that either Donald Trump didn't know the rules before he got in, so he wasn't prepped for them. The reality is that even Bernie Sanders is complaining now about the rules, and he knew the rules before he got into it. This is a situation of again, playing to the low-informed citizen, that they're not insiders, they don't know how conventions work. And like you said, the rules were set long before the campaign started. So once you get into the game, you cannot change the rules in the middle of the game. You can't do it.
Right, but there were complaints where people were taken off the voter rolls in New York. We saw that. There were people who had to wait in long lines. There was no paperwork.
But that's not a convention problem.
No, that's not a convention problem.
And that's not a party problem.
Right.
That is, for someone who registered people with NAACP for years, let me tell you, that's a complaint of the voting process. That's on the local level. That's folks who don't understand that, and by the way, most primaries don't get as many voters as this primary generated. And so what happens is that local clerks underestimate sometimes what they need. Now, that's one problem. The other problem is the issue of voter suppression. And when you look at some of these states, this was a deliberate effort to suppress the vote over this whole ID issue, which wasn't a problem prior to 2008.
Now that disproportionately affects African Americans,
Latinos, and elderly people.
What are the parties going to do about that? What's the Democratic Party going to do about that?
Well, the Democratic Party should be all on top of this, but really, to be quite candid, it's now a legal issue. It's being challenged in North Carolina, it's being challenged in states across the country. North Carolina, a federal judge just voted that it wasn't an issue to suppress the vote. It now will end up probably in the Supreme Court.
Well, this is also an important issue with the Supreme Court, as Joe just said, and it's important to keep that in mind because the Supreme Court overturned basically the Voting Rights Act.
Right.
It took away a lot of the federal government's ability to challenge some of the voter suppression from around the country. So this is why all of these candidates are right now saying, vote for me and you vote for nominees and justices on the Supreme Court who will be setting the law for generations to come.
And when it comes to the voter ID issue, also, one thing that doesn't get talked about very much is that it's also an issue about suppressing the woman's vote. Because they've done studies that show how many women change their names when they get married and don't change their ID. Or when they get divorced, don't change their name back or change their ID. And it's actually 50 to 60% of women who could be disenfranchised as well.
Let's listen to what Hillary Clinton had to say about that. Let's watch this.
Now, the other day, Mr. Trump accused me of playing the, quote, woman card. Well, if fighting for women's health care and paid family leave and equal pay is playing the woman card, then deal me in.
Great point, doesn't she?
Yeah, I mean, the other side of it is, and Joe made a great point, but when we look at this whole process, the Founding Fathers got it right when they said, we the people. Part of the problem here that we have is that people go and vote or find themselves that their vote has been suppressed or they feel that they've been denied an opportunity to vote. But we don't stay engaged. We go, we vote, we wipe our hands, and then we expect our elected officials to take care of things. So it's like putting a kid in a candy store. If you leave the kid in the candy store, he's going to keep putting, or she's going to keep putting their hand in the candy jar and get as much candy as they can until someone tells them to stop. You have elected officials who every few years do gerrymandering, and they change the way the districts are drawn, depending on who the political parties are. Right now, we're finding both on a national level as well on the local level, there are a lot of people that are recognizing that they can be part of this process. When people said in 2008, when Republicans said that change did not happen, they were mistaken. What we're seeing today in 2016 is a byproduct of what happened with President Obama and his change platform and his forward platform in 2012. What we don't like is the reflection of what we're seeing, because now you have 330 million Americans that are now recognizing that their voice does count. That's what 2008 meant. And today, in 2016, we're seeing a lot of those other people who felt left behind that are also being part of this and being engaged in this process. So what we see within the party system, there will be some changes that come along, but the people have to be the ones that force it. We've been having this conversation about parties and delegates for, this isn't the first time, this has been going on for decades.
Lenny, you want to say?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's an important point, but it's especially important because people only tend to focus on presidential years, but it's those midterm elections that have a huge consequence on our political culture. You look back to 2010, when the Democratic Party not only lost Congress, but lost state legislatures around the country and gubernatorial seats around the country. So what does that mean? That's when we redetermine, when we determine the districting for the, based on the census every 10 years. The Republican Party had a strategy for 2010 to turn out their voters and to be able to run those state legislatures so that the gerrymandering would favor their party. And we're seeing the consequences of this. In 2012, in Pennsylvania, for example, if you accumulated all of the votes for the House of Representatives, the Democrats probably won Pennsylvania by 100,000 votes. Guess what? Out of 18 congressional seats, 13 of those seats went to the Republican Party.
And I have to explain to my listeners, and probably maybe even to an international office, what does gerrymandering mean?
Right.
I mean, what's the term? You know, it's a term where you draw a district and it looks like some lizard, and in essence, and of course it came out of Massachusetts.
And you make sure all your supporters are within that.
And you make sure that your party has the number. So the focus, and this is one of the things I said about Bernie Sanders people, because we're now hearing people who are saying, you know, I'm not going to vote because my candidate didn't win. That has got to be, let me tell you, that's the most dangerous thing that people could say. But to talk about playing the card, the women's card, that's the same thing we heard in 2007 and 2008, Obama's playing the race card. And it doesn't fly in this country, because if there's an issue, of sexism, of xenophobia, the people who get in there and fight against it, that's who he's arguing against. That's who and it's going to backfire, I think, even in the Republican Party.
Right.
So sort of playing the woman card, I think, isn't necessarily playing the woman card. Obviously, there are lots of issues that get piled into that category called quote-unquote women's issues that I think are really better categorized as family issues. Equal pay for equal work, paid family leave, things like that, that I think are more at the top of the agenda of many women voters than perhaps of men voters. And so if one is going to play, quote unquote, the gender card or the woman card, I think that might be how Hillary can bring some of those Bernie Sanders supporters in, not so much saying I'm the woman, but I'm going to be there for you to advocate for these issues in a way that male candidates perhaps have not so much in the past.
Okay, Atiba, I want to get on to something else that we've been hearing a lot about this election cycle, and that is the money in the political system here in the United States. We've been hearing a lot about that, criticism of the campaign finance system. Of course, one of the loudest voices was that of Bernie Sanders. Let's take a listen to what he said.
The reality is that we have a corrupt campaign finance system which separates the American people's needs and desires from what Congress is doing. So to my mind, what we have got to do is wage a political revolution. where millions of people who have given up on the political process stand up and fight back, demand a government that represents us and not just a handful of campaign contributors.
Campaign finance in the United States, is that just another name for corruption?
Before you ask me that, one of the things I wanted to go into was the idea that when we talk about these different issues that keep dividing us, it's economic. And so when we start talking about the political process and how much money is in it, whether or not you call it corruption or campaign finance, there is a lot of money that goes into this system. And when we talk about, we've been talking about women's pay, we've been talking about family leave. We're not talking about the billions of dollars that are spent on these elections, or the fact that we have this primary system where it goes far too long, starts in January, we're going all the way till June, so much money that's being thrown at candidates. I think it's great that Bernie Sanders can say that 7 million people have given him $27 or more but each one of these states costs money to run these primaries. Why do we have a primary system where all these different dates? Why can't we just have one date? That would cut down the cost in itself. And then we have this process of the Electoral College. When you look at the Electoral College and the candidates only going to swing states but not trying to get the complete popular vote. So is this a democratic system, or is it one that's already rigged? And is it one in which, you know, when people talk about campaign finance, we can talk about the Koch brothers, we can talk about how much money is being put in. Is the presidency being bought, is what a lot of people keep asking. How much of tax dollars are going into once the candidates win their party's nomination? How much of that money comes from taxpayers to go to these candidates? There's so much money that's here. How you address that, if it's through campaign finance, I don't know if you can say it from that standpoint, but what we do know is when the top 1% has enough money to be able to throw at a candidate, to be able to gain access, it takes the attention off of the little person who is now crying out and saying, me, 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 which is what we see behind Trump folks and we see behind Bernie Sanders folks.
Right. But of course, there's no way to fix that. I mean, it's a great conversation to have at this stage of the game, but we've got Citizens United, we've got the Supreme Court who has ruled that these contributions are permissible, and until the Congress can pass legislation that can then get to the Supreme Court again to, for lack of a better term, trump that decision, there's nothing that can be done because those are legal contributions.
But there's nothing we can say that there's nothing you can do in 2016.
Correct.
But we have to also be looking ahead to 2018 and to
Absolutely.
2020.
Absolutely.
And that process does not change unless people are engaged and stay involved in the process.
Okay, Lenny, I want to get to something else, something that was talked about today on the Republican side, and that is foreign policy. There was that foreign policy speech made by Donald Trump. And as we heard from our reporter at the beginning of the program, the themes of that speech was America First will be an overriding theme, I guess, of the Trump administration. No more nation building, as Donald Trump said. What did you make of that?
Well, it's a typical Donald Trump speech because really he was speaking like the deal maker that's part of his brand. Basically, he's saying that he's firm on the national interest, but he's flexible on how to accomplish it. That's really the sort of mentality of a deal maker, and that's really how he's been able to portray himself throughout this campaign. But at the core of his speech, it's a nationalist message. It's a message that America comes first, that our obligations abroad are fine, we have to exert American power, we have to exert leadership, but other people have to share, that America is sort of a chump. We are spending all this money to defend other nations. They're getting a free ride, he's effectively saying. And because of that, we're not rebuilding our roads and our bridges and taking care of the things we need to take care of at home. So it's a very, very nationalist message. It's about strength, but it's also about focusing on the interests of the United States and solely on the interests of the United States.
You know, Joe, if America is first, then I tell you what he should do. Then get all of these so-called corporations that put their money off and offshore. I think the trillions and trillions, and I don't even know the exact figures now. I mean, it's in the multitudes of trillions of dollars, and it is said if they paid their actual share, I mean, and we're not talking about what even the Reagan administration administration required.
Yeah.
You would have enough money to rebuild the infrastructure, but if you notice with look, let's quit. The media in this is part of the problem in this country. I'm going to be very honest with you. That speech had absolutely no specificity. None. None. And
Okay,
not one reporter had
No.
the audacity to say, wait a minute,
And-
what about this? What about that? How are you going to do this? We live in a global community where
Right.
68 people on this globe have more wealth than I think 1/2 of the human population.
Okay, Joanne, let me ask you about this foreign policy speech in another way. This is what Foreign Policy magazine said about this America First theme. It said, after years of American adventurism underwritten by neoconservative and liberal interventionist administrations, Donald Trump, knowingly or unknowingly, has consistently outlined a more restrained vision for America's relations with the world. And Foreign Policy says he is in sync with the majority of Americans.
I don't think he's outlined any policy.
No.
And notwithstanding that, I was told by one of the people who was putting on this speech today that I might not want to attend because I might not understand it because
Right.
it was so complicated on foreign policy issues, which it obviously was not. And I think he's trying to, I mean, he's obviously channeling a certain attitude and anger of the American people, but that's not the role of a leader. The role of a leader is to say what is best for this country. Let's take a look at what the country is doing, what is the state of the world, and for him to just continue with these platitudes of, we're going to build a wall, we're going to keep them out, that's not foreign policy.
Does that perhaps explain his popularity, that he's not good on specifics? He can say these bold
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. That's
Absolutely it
exactly
does.
right. You don't have to think when you hear him.
Heaven forbid.
There's no substance. For me, as a Republican, as a black Muslim American, he's offensive in terms of the language that he uses, in terms of this idea that, in terms of making America great, in terms of how he wants to do this. This is only going to alienate us further in the world. Right. And that's part of the problem that we have today. America has this idea, we've become a real bully. America has this idea, and that bully recognized and found out that, hey, we can be attacked, we can be hurt, we're vulnerable. But the best way to protect our vulnerability is to find ways to be more peaceful and have a better approach to how we deal with other countries.
You tend to, you don't go to war with people you trade with. You don't go to war with people you have business relationships with. And what he fails to realize is that the United States is still the country everybody wants to come to and do business.
Okay, got a final question, and that's for you, Lenny, and that is, we can see the outlines of who's going to be competing against whom in the general election. How do you rate Donald Trump's chances?
I'm sorry, what was that?
How would you rate Donald Trump's chances in the general election?
Well, everything's possible in the general election. Donald Trump shows strength among a certain group of Americans. He may have the Republican Party unite behind him. That's still to be seen. If he does, he can put states into the sort of competition in the fall. And if he puts enough states in the competition because of our electoral college, there's always a chance that he can become president. But I wouldn't bet my house on it.
Okay, Leonard Steinhorn, Joe Madison, Joanne Bamberger, and Atiba Madyan. Thanks to all of you for joining us.
Thank you.
That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.